midterm, and then the next time you looked at it, it was like starting all over again. That was me for like at least 6 times that I had it. I never understood it. So I had to teach it, and now I think I understand. So I'm gonna do my best. You'll probably understand it by the end of the day, and then you'll come back Thursday and we'll have to start all over again. But that's my disclaimer for today. So what I wanted to start with, because I like to start with, I often like to start with a story, especially one that sort of links class to real life. This is not real life. This is one I forgot to show you before when we talked about being overweight. This is a picture from when leptin was first discovered. And these are mice that are more or less identical, except this mouse had its leptin knocked out. So these are like very different strains of mice. You knock out leptin, they get really obese. And this is why initially people thought injecting obese people with leptin was the answer to obesity, but then it turns out that obese people have plenty of leptin. They just don't have the receptors or don't respond to it. And that picture was at the end of my slideshow. I forgot to show it. My story today, before we get into the nitty-gritty, my story today is about conflict. It's about conflict because you'll find out, if you haven't already, as you get older, there's only so much time, and there's more and more things that you have to do. For example, there's a conflict between work and family. Because if you work harder, you can provide more and better for your family. But as you work harder, then you're away from your family. So it creates this conflict that's kind of difficult. In my own conflict, there's actually, if you're an academic, there's internal conflict because there's also conflict with work. In the sense that, as a professor, you have this. It doesn't matter. There's this internal conflict where the reality is, whether you realize it or not, as professors, we get promoted for doing research. As you may have figured out, if you're a crappy teacher, but you do great research and bring in lots of money, you'll get tenure and you'll get promoted. Whereas if you're a great teacher and you don't do research, then we'll see you later. That's just how it works at the big universities. So the way that I've dealt with this conflict, both the internal one and the personal one, is I simply eliminate it. In the sense that I don't think you can be a good researcher if you're not a good teacher. You have to be able to teach people like why studying frogs is important. At the same time, I don't think you can be a good teacher if you're not a good researcher. I have to know what the current literature is and what's happening and go to the conferences and things. Otherwise, I'm not teaching you science, I'm teaching you history. There are other sort of unique ways, I think, that I've eliminated the conflict. One is, there's this saying, don't bring work home and don't bring your personal stuff to work. I absolutely disagree. I think I could share a story about my conehead son and make birth and partition and delivery as a science more interesting because there's a personal touch. So I think I can bring personal stuff to you and actually improve my work. At the same time, I think that works for families. So there's I don't know if you can see that now, there's my son when he was about 2 years old. And so instead of me going away to do research in the field and leaving my family alone, I could take them with me. And they benefit. He grew up, and now he's had a biology degree, and he's working, doing PCR for a biotech company in biology. And I like to think, this experience he had with me had something to do with that. I took both of them. So there's my son and my daughter. We all went off into the field. But I think it had a big influence on my daughter as well. She didn't go into the field with me as much, but there she was on Friday. I think it had a big influence. She's presenting her first poster at a scientific conference in Washington, D.C. She's studying neuromuscular function in obese mice and why obese mice can't keep their balance and fall over. Here's the less professional picture. And you'll see how the conflict plays out. You can't see it because these weird lights that I can't turn off. Because I'm wearing the same clothes that I talked to you on Thursday. So I had to leave here and fly out and then get to go see her, and she did a great job. But the other thing she did is she became like a nationally ranked gymnast. So there she is. She's number 3 in the country in gymnastics, in addition to being a biology major. And again, I think that me sharing my professional experience with her had something to do with that. So here she is at 2 years old, and my son's somewhere up there. And what you can't see is I'm down here photographing her, like probably she's 20 feet up that rock face. And I think this fearlessness that she gained by being in the field with me is what contributed to her being both a gymnast as well as being a biologist. And I show this picture because I think it epitomizes how you eliminate that conflict. One is, because of work, I could have been away from my family for a week during this photo, but I got to have a pretty good experience with my son and daughter at a very young age. So I got to share work with family, and vice versa, family with work. Two is, I think it had a big impact on both of them. They both became our biologists, budding biologists. But two, I think it also, that's three. I usually have 3 points. I think you also benefit. Because not only am I doing research and spending time with my family, but I also now, instead of giving you a boring lecture on how the kidney works to maintain osmoregulation, as I get to tell you a great story of why my daughter didn't pee in the desert. Because when I would take her, I wouldn't have to change her diaper for 3 or 4 days. She wouldn't pee or poop. And the reasons are, she had to osmoregulate. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Why my daughter doesn't pee in the desert. You'll learn several other things by the time we're done. But that's the key one. So what we're going to talk about today is osmoregulation. I'm going to tell you about the osmostat, and I wrote not really, because what I'm going to tell you is a lie. We're going to take 2 days to figure out why that is. It's not really true, what I'm going to tell you. But I'll tell you why they thought that. We're going to talk about where there's sodium and water losses, and why they're important. And most important, the biggest way that you retain water and sodium is through the kidneys. So most of the day will be spent talking about how the kidney works. I know most of you only care about humans, but I'm going to give you a comparative perspective. Because I think the comparative perspective helps you understand the beauty of the mammalian kidney. So you'll just have to sit through it. But before we really talk about the unit of the kidney and how it works, is we'll talk about membranes in a very simple way. Many of you have already had it, but I know I've been teaching this course for 21 years. Some of you haven't, or you've forgotten. So if you've already had how different membranes work, I don't know, text your friend or do whatever it is. Let the rest of us catch up to you. And then finally, we're going to talk about how sodium and water is regulated across the nephron. So first, let's talk about why it's important to regulate sodium and water. Because the reason my daughter and my son aren't peeing or pooping in the desert is because they have to conserve sodium and water, in particular water, in this situation. What are the costs? Sodium is important, as well as other ions, but we're going to focus on sodium and water. It's going to be complicated enough just focusing on those two things. Too much sodium is bad. One, your blood pressure goes up. We already sort of talked about that with glucose. If the sodium in your blood is too high, blood pressure goes up. If blood pressure goes up, there's a strain on the heart. Long term, you could go blind because of the blood pressure bursting blood vessels, the tiny, tiny blood vessels that lead to your eyes that are important in your vision. And ultimately, you can die from kidney damage because, as we'll talk about today, the very small blood vessels that pump blood through the kidney under high blood pressure, those can be damaged, and you can die from kidney damage. If sodium is too low, there's decreased blood pressure, so you can't get nutrients to the brain properly. And also, if sodium is low, when I say blood pressure, I'm talking about hydrostatic pressure. We'll talk about the difference in a second. If sodium is too high, there's also increased osmotic pressure, which means you can dehydrate your tissues, including the cells in your brain. Right? You could go into seizure, as we'll talk about on Thursday, and die from that. If sodium is too low, you have decreased osmotic pressure. So you can actually damage your brain cells because water leaks out of your blood and into your brain cells. We'll talk about an example of how you can die from that. Some of you may already know the example. We'll talk about how you can die from that. If you don't maintain proper sodium, we've talked about this over and over again, your cells don't have the proper charge. Your nerves can't fire. Remember, the action potential involves sodium coming into the cell. Depolarization involves sodium coming into the cell. So if you don't have proper sodium, you can't maintain cell function. Your neurons can't fire. Remember, sodium coming into the cell, that depolarization is necessary for the calcium to come in for all vesicle release. It means you couldn't release neurotransmitters or any of the second messenger systems that we talked about, where calcium has to come in and vesicles have to bind and release things. None of those can happen if you didn't have proper sodium balance. Your heart couldn't beat. Water is important for kind of the same reasons, right? If there's too much water, there's an increase in blood pressure. Same problems we already talked about. If there's too little water, there's a decrease in blood pressure. Same problems we talked about with sodium. Those are the hydrostatic problems. Hydrostatic is like if I'm filling a balloon up with water, how much water I put in, how taut it makes the rubber on the balloon. That's the hydrostatic pressure. If there's too much water relative to sodium and other solutes, there's a decrease in osmotic pressure. And the opposite, if there's too much water, you can start to flood the cells. Too much water in your blood. If there's too much water in your blood, you can start to flood your cells with water because of the osmotic difference. That can kill you. If there's too little water, there's an increase in osmotic pressure, and you can dehydrate tissues. Again, same as we just talked about for sodium. This can send you into a seizure. One of my kids got kind of close. Not that that's funny. Talk about that in a second. So, as we'll see, there are reasons that my daughter weren't peeing in the desert is to, one, try to stop these things from happening. So let's talk now about the gains and losses in water and sodium. And why it's so important in this little person that I had in the desert. So let's just say, and I would never do this, let's just say I slice my daughter in half, sagittally, so right down the middle. You get something that looks like this. You know I'm not a great artist, but it's like Homer Simpson there for a second. So more or less should look like that. Here are the sources. Here's what she's got to regulate. Here's what she's working with. One is, how many people take George Brooks' class? Only one person. Does he talk about like surface area to body mass and sweating and water loss? Okay, don't worry about it. So one of the biggest losses is, especially if you're a little one, is there's a larger surface area to volume ratio. And we're going to talk about the osmostat, but there's also a thermostat. You have to regulate temperature. And if you're in the desert, it's 110 degrees, which we were. We were collecting some desert frogs called spia, which mine's very familiar with. And it's 110 degrees. If you have a very large surface area to volume ratio, you lose water. You dehydrate much more quickly because you sweat. So imagine, for example, if you wet a sheet of paper and you wet a sponge. The paper has the largest surface area to volume ratio. It's going to dry out much, much quicker than the sponge because you have more surface area for the evaporator. So she's losing, because I used to hike them. She was 3 years old. I would hike her for 3, 4, 5 hours at a time. So in that situation, you're losing a lot of water and salt to sweat because if the brain goes over like 100 degrees for like a few minutes, it fries. You can have a seizure, go into coma, and die. So you have to keep the body temperature down. You do that, mammals do that, by sweating, and the heat of evaporation, losing the water off the surface of your skin, cools the body. So first and foremost, you have to keep the brain cool. So she's losing a lot of water from sweat. Where else do you lose water? Respiration. That's why you pant when you're overheated, because you're also evaporating water off of your mouth and your digestive tract. That's why dogs pant. They're actually cooling themselves down. But from respiration, you're losing water as well. Who? Saliva seems minimal, but I was going to ask, who said they're wrestled again? Raise your hand again. Did you guys ever have to spit? Because you know what I'm talking about. So you also lose water through salivation. For the non-wrestlers, if you were like what, like a pound, don't make me exaggerate. How much did you lose by spitting?
Maybe a pound or two.
A pound, yeah. So if you were like overweight, they would like put you on the bus and make you spit like all the way to the beach. You lose a pound from spitting. You guys, the wrestlers are backing me up. So salivate, you lose water. Where else are you losing water? Defecation. That's taking a poop if you're 3 years old. And a big one is urination. There are other circumstances that were not relevant to my 3-year-old daughter. Like if you're lactating, you lose a lot of water. But these are the major sources, unless I'm forgetting. Water gains are metabolic. Who knows what I mean by metabolic gain? When you burn things, like carbohydrates, but especially fats. When you hydrolyze fat, one of the, I guess, byproducts is water. So for example, if you were like me, when you were a kid, you were told that a camel stored water in its hump. And that's why it could walk across the desert. They don't store water in their hump, it's fat. And as they burn that fat, water is released in the hydrolysis of that fat, and they can actually use that water. So there's metabolic water gains. The other big gains are from eating and drinking. Well, that generates two problems for my daughter. One is, I told you, she's got to sweat a lot, so she's losing and respire. I'm hiking my 3-year-old through the desert. She's got to breathe, so she's losing water. She's got to sweat, because she can't overheat. And two, I'm a big, having a baby's weird. I just bought a new bike. When you buy a new bike, they give you an instruction manual and a whole little demonstration. You get a baby, they just give them to you and tell you, okay, take it home. So I had no idea. So I'm a big guy, I got a low surface area to volume ratio. I can hike 4 or 5 hours without drinking or eating. So I used to hike, I'm not joking, I used to hike my little kids 3, 4, 5 hours in the desert with no water, no food. In fact, one day my son said, Dad, I can't walk anymore. He passed out. I was like, what's wrong? What's wrong? We're in Deep Spring Valley. I said, we got 3 more hours to go. So my daughter didn't get that much to eat or drink. And she didn't have no fat. She's always been a solid bone muscle. So she had very little metabolic water. So the only options are to resorb water from the intestine, which means that you don't generate feces because you have to have water in the intestine, or you generate very little. And to resorb water across the kidney so that you don't lose it during urination. Because mammals, unlike amphibians, can't resorb water from their bladder, so you have to stop it before it gets in the bladder. Frogs can do it. And even though my daughter's named after a frog, she can't really resorb the Cassina. She can't really absorb the water from her bladder. So as a result, your biggest way of conserving water is primarily, actually, somewhat through the intestines, but primarily by preventing water from being lost across the kidney. And in part you do that by coupling that with preventing sodium from being lost across the kidney. And it's like the same thing we talked about with glucose. It's not just when you're in distress, like in this situation. You're doing that right now. Right now, you are balancing your sodium in your water. Your blood pressure is not going up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down. But you're osmoregulating, should be, every minute of your life. Questions or comments? So here's where we're at. I want to take a minute to talk about kidneys, and I want to do that in a comparative way, because I found, even though I know most of you are only interested in humans, I found that by explaining the kidney across animals helps you understand why the mammalian kidney is so unique in its ability to concentrate, to make concentrated urine. I want to start with a cucaracha. I want to start with insects. Because insects don't have kidneys. If you cut a cockroach or any insect, sagittal like this, on a cockroach, I slice it like this. They don't have kidneys, they have these things called Malpighian tubules. There might be an H. After the P?
Yeah.
Who said there is an H? Oh, that's how I was going to say, how do you know that? Now I know how you know that. But see, you should be impressed that I remembered that there might be an H. And what these things are these tubules, and they collect small molecules from these animals. At least might have to correct me. I don't know that much about insects other than how to feed them the frogs. But I need to feed myself, but it doesn't require knowledge in this situation. What they're allowed to do, or what these things do, for example, if there's too much sodium, they can pump, it actually costs energy, they can pump that sodium, these Malpighian, is it pronounced Malpighian or Malpighian? Fidget, Malpighian. They can pump these ions to maintain their osmoregulatory balance. But here's the disadvantage that we humans have exploited. They only have channels for certain small molecules. Sodium chloride, I'm making up time. Sodium's one of them. They only have channels for certain small molecules. So for example, if you put in there, if you feed them a molecule, a synthetic molecule, like let's say an insecticide, a DDT for example, they don't have a channel for DDT. So even though they can osmoregulate small molecules that they may have encountered for millions of years, they can't regulate a molecule that they've never seen because there's not a channel for it. So you can give them the pesticide, and even if they can metabolize or deactivate that pesticide, they have no way to get it out of their bodies. So even if that pesticide doesn't kill them by some toxic effect directly, eventually they'll die because they'll go into some osmotic imbalance that they can't control because they can't get rid of small molecules. And so those molecules, even if they're toxic to vertebrate animals, won't have the same osmoregulatory impact because of the invention of the vertebrate kidney. Does that all make sense? So that's the first reason why the kidney is important. The vertebrate kidney works in the following way. I'm not talking about mammals right now. This is for everything except mammals and birds. Inside the kidney, blood flows through something called the efferent. I always mix the two up. No, sorry, the afferent. Yeah. See, I told you I always mix them up. I'm alive. Just tell the truth. The blood comes from something called an afferent. But see, I always think afferent means away, but it doesn't mean away from the kidney. That's funny. My mnemonic is incorrect. So the blood comes through. So imagine that that's my left, right? My left arm is my afferent. So blood's coming through. It's got all kinds of small molecules in it. It's got glucose in it, it's got sodium in it. I don't know, maybe I just ate a cockroach, so it's got some DDT in it. It's got all kinds of small molecules plus some protein. And when it hits these arterioles, blood's coming through this way, what do you think happens when it hits these very small blood vessels? The hydrostatic pressure increases, like pinching a water hose. So it generates this ultrafiltrate. It filters out all small molecules. So it doesn't matter if it's DDT or if it's some molecule you've never seen before. You are sort of protected because the kidney filters. You might hear that the liver detoxifies because the liver might metabolize and make something water soluble, like attach a glucose to it or a glutathione or a sulfate group or something like that. The liver might make it water soluble, but it's the kidney that gets rid of every small molecule. And then the things that you want, as we'll talk about in a second, you resorb. And all the things that you don't want, you get rid of. So whereas the Malpighian, now I know how to pronounce it, whereas the Malpighian tubule can only take out certain molecules that it's seen, evolutionarily speaking, The vertebrate kidney filters out everything small. Gets rid of the stuff you don't want, whether it's glucuronidated steroids or some toxin, ETOH, all small molecules, and recovers what you don't want. Now the difference is between birds and mammals and other vertebrates is that if you look at the kidney, there's a whole bunch of these nephrons that filter out these small molecules. But they're unable, without a lot of energy, to concentrate the urine. I'll tell you what we do different in a minute. So they can filter out these small molecules, right? So there's an apparatus like this one. They filter out the small molecules, they end up in a collecting duct, and they go to the bladder. But they're unable to concentrate. So things like marine reptiles and seagulls, they have to use a lot of energy to pump salt out, because like seawater is salty, right? So they have to use a lot of energy through special salt glands to pump salt out. Or fish that are in the ocean, right? They're hypoosmotic relative to the ocean. They have special cells in their gills to pump salt out into the ocean so that they don't become hyperosmotic. Birds and mammals have figured out a way to do that without costing so much ATP. So you go from limited ability to filter out small molecules, ability to filter out small molecules, but not to concentrate. So that was an amphibian, a fish, or a reptile, more or less. This ain't comparative anatomy. Here, I'll draw it better when it comes to mammals. Birds have these series of loops in their kidney. And we'll spend the rest of the day talking about how these loops work. These loops allow a counter-current multiplier to concentrate urine. So birds are a little bit better. They have these loops, and we're going to spend the rest of the day figuring out how this works. And then you're going to forget how it works, and we're going to do it again on Thursday. That's my finding. You have to do it at least twice, and then you'll forget it again until you become a med student. So birds have these loops that allow them to a limited capacity to concentrate urine. Mammals take these loops to another step. And this is the last bit of comparative stuff. The mammalian kidney is organized in a slightly different fashion. Oops. This one big kidney and one little kidney. That's drinking too much. The mammalian urinary system, and here's all you have to know from me. If you want to know something more, take Tom Carlson's anatomy class. There is all you have to know from me. The kidney has a cortex, which just means covering. And it has a medulla, which just means in the middle. There's something called the renal pelvis. And what's in the kidney is an array. Who's ever eaten kidney? You know how it's like all crunchy when you like chop it up and stuff? That's because you're eating these nephrons that we're going to talk about today. It has this array of parallel. I'm making up the number. I don't know. Maybe there's 100,000 or something. I don't know how many. It doesn't matter. I'm making it up. So it has this array of nephrons that are in this loop morphology that we're going to talk about today. Those nephrons all empty into collecting ducts, which empty into the ureter, and the urine travels down the ureter, where it's stored in the bladder, and then the bladder empties into the urethra if you're a mammal. If you're anything else, it empties directly into the same place as the digestive tract. You have one hole if you're not a mammal. We're good? What's regulated, and we'll do the nephron and say, one other thing.